Dream big, never stop dreaming, because you can do whatever that you want as long as you believe in your dreams.
Happy Halloween and welcome to the Dare to Dream Productions podcast. We have a very special episode today for our Halloween and horror movie series. Please welcome Sonia Lupher, film scholar and founder and editor of Cutthroat Woman, a database of women who make horror movies. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So can you give us a little introduction about your database, Cutthroat Woman, and what your inspiration for starting it was?
Sure. So it started off when I was a master's student in film studies at Columbia University, almost 10 years ago now. And when I was there, I worked on this project called the Women Film Pioneers Project, which is a massive database of women working behind the scenes in the silent era, basically from the start of cinema, 1895, through the beginning of sound. So when it started off, the project, the program director of the project, she didn't think there would be, a lot of women to come out of that, but it turns out there were thousands and thousands and thousands of women working, as directors, screenwriters, cinematographers, all sorts of things behind the camera that people just didn't know about because they had been forgotten. So that database has become a massive historiographic project to uncover the history of women in film production. So that was one thing that sort of led me to women in horror. I've always been a horror fan, and I was thinking, it was around the time that American Mary came out, the Soska Sisters film. And I was thinking, that's cool. I haven't seen too many horror films directed by women. I wonder how many women are making horror. It might be fun to come up with a little list. So I started just putting together names, and it eventually just, as I kept working on it, I found that it wasn't just a list of 20 or 30 names, but hundreds, and still growing. So that was kind of how it came about. I've been working on it in some form or another since about 2012, but it didn't go live, obviously, until just a couple of years ago. So that's kind of where it came from.
Wow, very cool. I love American Mary. That was like one of my first horror films that I watched that was directed by two women, and it got me into I don't know, would you consider that movie feminist? It's kind of, I don't know, we were just on a podcast last week with Anna Biller, and we were talking about feminism in horror films. So it's kind of hard to consider what movies are feminist. But do you have what would you define feminist films?
That's a really hard question, and I think it differs for filmmakers. I think the Soska sisters would say that they did make a feminist film according to their values of their feminist values, and body positivity in certain ways. So I think they would say it's a feminist film, and I think others might say it's not. But that's up to the filmmakers and the audiences, I think, to decide. Yeah. It's a really hard question, I think, to really say for sure if this is a feminist film or isn't.
I feel like film theorists have been debating that question for years, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just in horror.
So across your studies, what stereotypes or tropes have you discovered that involve women in horror films?
I think it really varies by subgenre. So, slasher films are going to have a lot of sexually active, young, attractive, thin women. So that's kind of a stereotype there, as opposed to the final girl in the slasher film, who is more of a, not prudish, but a little bit less sexually active, a little bit more reserved. So we have these very clear opposites in slasher films. But in other films, it really, again, it depends sort of on the subgenre, but I think that the motherhood trope is a big one. Mothers come up in horror film on all sides of the spectrum. They're either, evil, or they're vulnerable, or they're violent, or they're just scary because because they're mothers and their bodies can carry children. And so I think that's a big one that I see across subgenres, including slasher films.
The final girl trope is continuously used in horror films. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so it really refers to the last girl standing. So the girl who is sort of attacked and chased, I guess depending again on what subgenre you're looking at, but in the slasher film, she's the one who manages not only to escape the killer and see the killer coming and to also suspect that there is one earlier on, but she's the one who can fight back. And she usually is triumphant against the killer, at least until the sequel. So that's kind of the general idea, that Carol Clover came up with back in the 90s.
Is she a film theorist? I haven't heard of her.
Yeah. So Carol Clover is a film scholar who she came up with that term, the final girl, and she theorized slasher films extensively in her book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws. So it's a really good read. And, there's a lot of it that I think still holds up in a lot of ways, but horror has evolved so much that I think there are a lot of ways that it's changed a lot too. So,
do you think that trope is going to continue?
Yeah, I absolutely think it will. I mean, we've seen different kinds of final girls now in different kinds of genres as well. Even movies like Alien and more recently Revenge, which is a rape revenge movie. But there's only one woman in that movie, but she's also the final girl. So yeah, I think it's going to continue.
Do you think it's a positive or a negative trope?
I think it really depends on who's behind the camera. I think it's become a positive trope. I think it's something that women can find a lot of catharsis in, that figure. But it also is, at least in slasher films, the class, 1980s slasher films, it can be a little bit limiting. And the idea that the final girl is kind of the good girl and the reserved girl. And I think that idea is a little bit negative. And I think that women now are moving on from that idea. And again, Revenge is a good example of feminists and filmmakers moving on, creating new stuff. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's really gory.
Ooh, I like that subtitle. It's interesting because also I feel like the final girl is a girl who is feminine, very feminine, and it's like sometimes like her body's like fragmented, like kind of the male gaze, it explores that too, like I feel like. Yeah,
she is feminine in a lot of ways. If you look at the Carol Clover book, she talks a lot about gender and sort of androgyny between she says basically that the killer and the final girl have an affinity, and they're both coded in terms of their perceived gender, but they also have elements that transgress that gender, and that they have a common ground with, if that makes sense. So the final girl, she's a little bit sexually rigid, and the killer is sexually frustrated in some way. So there's some sort of overlap there. And she also points out that a lot of the names, even the names of the girls, like Lori or Marty, I'm trying to think of others, it can be androgynous names. So I think fragmentation is a really good word for it, because there's a lot of different stuff going on there, and it's a little bit conflicting.
What kind of other things do you see evolving in horror movies, like tropes or stereotypes?
I see a lot of reimagining of final girls and other tropes, at least in women-directed horror, because women directors of horror are huge horror fans too. They're very knowledgeable. They know so much about horror. They've seen so many horror movies, and they use that knowledge to kind of turn horror tropes on their head. And one example that just came to my mind is it's not directed by a woman, but it's written by a woman. It's a short film called Girl Number Two, and it's about this sorority house under siege by a masked killer, like a giant, killer with a hammer or something. And there are two girls left, and one of them is slightly taller, slightly thinner than the other, and she says, "Oh, you should go because I'm going to be killed next because I'm prettier." And then they just have this argument about who's prettier and why one of them should be killed and the other one shouldn't be because of horror movie tropes. So that's a really funny example. It becomes a comedy at the end because we all know that just having seen horror movies, what to expect about who's going to die next and who is going to survive, and they do too. So it's kind of a fun turning that idea on its head.
Film theorist Laura Mulvey writes about the role of women in film and defines the male gaze as women are characterized by their to-be-looked-atness and as an object of male desire. Where do you see the male gaze in horror films?
It's funny because just a couple of nights ago I was watching Alien Resurrection, and it's just got so many, gory alien mother figures in it. It's just, as I was watching it, I was thinking, this is such a dude idea of what pregnancy and childbirth is, it looks like, and the experience of it is. It's just such a dude idea of what it is, and coming from somebody who clearly has never had experience with that. So I think that's one big place where we see the male gaze is in terms of pregnancy. And I would also add David Cronenberg, although I think he's pretty self-aware of this fear of women's bodies that comes through in his films, like Dead Ringers and The Fly, just things happening to women's bodies. It's a man's body in The Fly as well, but Dead Ringers, I think, is especially chilling example of male fear about women's bodies. And so I think that's a big place where the male gaze comes in, is just this sort of mystical reverence but grotesque fear of female bodies. So, yeah.
Have any female filmmakers challenged the male gaze?
Yeah, absolutely. I think every single one does in some way or another. But a couple that just came to my mind were Ashlyn Clark, who directed The Devil's Doorway. She very actively challenges the male gaze in that film. There's a scene, I don't remember the procedure that she's talking about, but it's where they basically cut it during childbirth, where they cut open. It's not a C-section. I don't remember what it's called. I'd have to look it up. But it's just very violent and very. It's not done anymore. It's a sort of barbaric practice to forcibly remove the baby from your vagina, basically. And she, instead of focusing on what's going on over there, she focuses only on the girl's face, and she zooms in really closely onto her face as she's undergoing this very painful procedure without any anesthetic. So she has, she's talked to me about this as well. She's not interested at all in showing the gore in scenes, especially scenes with violence against women's bodies, but she's more interested in taking away from the gore and focusing, even though her films are gory, focusing more on the face and making us uncomfortable with that. And another example is a short film directed by Misty Dawn called Hooker Assassin, which is a rape revenge movie. And in that one, you don't actually see the rape. It cuts, and then it cuts to afterward, what happened. But she's told me this as well, she didn't want to show the rape scene. She just wanted, she finds rape revenge movies cathartic, but if I'm remembering what she said right, basically she finds them cathartic, but that they shouldn't have the rape scene in them. If they didn't have the rape scene in them, it would be a much more palatable genre, I guess. So that was an active choice on her part.
I think in a lot of horror movies, the female characters suffer from a lot of trauma and are labeled as victims. What's your opinion on this?
So I agree in some ways, and I think a lot of women agree as well. Um, and it just sort of depends on how the film represents that. There's a great book by Kiera Janice called House of Psychotic Women that's all about how, as a spectator, she would watch horror films and work through her own trauma. So seeing the trauma of women on screen kind of helped her deal with her own family trauma. And I've heard that from a lot of other women too, you know, that horror is cathartic and that it helps people deal with things that have happened to them. So that's one thing. But another thing is, I guess one issue that I take with the final girl trope is that it sort of turns victimhood on its head, and it makes women warriors instead, which is great. But it also can obscure the importance of working through and healing from trauma, and sort of using trauma as a source of power as well. So I think a lot of women directors are starting to do that a lot in their films, you know, looking at making their characters vulnerable at the same time as they're making them fighters.
Definitely. I think that reminds me of Jennifer Kent, The Babadook.
Yeah.
Kind
absolutely.
of like how that film is kind of like a look on, you know, it's not really about a monster at the end of the day.
Yeah, that film and also her next film, The Nightingale, they both are, I think, very much in line with that.
I still have to see that.
Yeah, it's not a fun watch. It's really, really unpleasant. So it's grueling, I would say. It's just a grueling film.
So it didn't leave like a good good feeling at that.
I mean, it's a great film. I'm not sure I'm going to watch it again, but it's a great film, and I'm glad I saw it when I did.
So in 2018, iconic horror producer Jason Blum said something very controversial. He said, "There are not a lot of female directors, period, and even less who are inclined to do horror," which upset many female horror filmmakers because, you know, we do exist, and just because we're female doesn't mean we don't like gore or monsters. And he did apologize, but what did you think of his comment?
So at the time, I saw his comment when it came out, and I tweeted back at him and said, hey, you know, I've come up with a list of, at that point it was like 600 something women horror directors actively working. So, you know, I was just one of many voices who took issue with that. And I think he's doing a good job of giving women work and creating spaces for women in his company. So I don't want to, you know, criticize him much about that. I think it was an honest mistake, but I think it also points to a broader problem where you don't immediately think of women because they're just not visible or as visible as male directors. So yeah, like it was just a really dumb thing to say, and but it also points to bigger issues in the film industry.
I definitely agree, and I'm glad you did speak out, you know, against it and tell him there are women in film and in horror films too. But I think he is definitely, like, Blumhouse is changing. Like, do you know Gigli, Saul Guillermo? Yeah.
Yeah, she made the Culture Shock episode on Hulu recently, which I think was produced by Blumhouse. Is that right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really loved her film. I saw it at Etheria Film Night a couple of years ago. Yeah,
she's really great. I'm very excited to see like her upcoming films.
Oh, me too. Yeah, she's amazing. Her short films are so good. If you can track them down, she's one person that I was going to recommend.
So there's a whole month dedicated to female filmmakers in February, and we already talked about the Saska sisters, but they used to make a PSA for Women in Horror Month. Were you involved at all in this organization?
No, I wasn't. The person who's involved in that is, Hannah Neurotica is the founder of Women in Horror Month, and she founded it, I think, back in like 2009. So it's been a while since she founded it, and I think she was the sort of powerhouse behind that whole initiative. If I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong about that. And I know Hannah a little bit, and have met some of the people involved, but I've never been involved in that myself.
Yeah, I'm wondering because I used to like watch the PSAs. I wonder if they're still doing it because I think last year they didn't, or maybe they did, but I didn't see it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't remember, but I don't know if they're doing it now because of COVID and other things,
Yeah.
So
True.
I'm sure it'll come back.
Yeah, they could do quarantine like
That's true, yeah.
PSAs, like make a because it is scary like this time. So
It is, yeah.
so how can audience members or just people in general support female filmmakers specifically in the horror genre?
I think sharing their work is a big one. I keep seeing lists of like top horror, and there's still very few women. And if there are women, it's always the same ones. So I think just actively viewing and sharing the work that people find, that's one important way. Especially short films, because a lot of women are directing shorts more than anything. Yeah, so circulating, especially short films directed by women. There are a lot on Alter and Vimeo, and funding women's films. There are a lot of crowdfunding campaigns out there. So just keeping an eye on that kind of stuff and contributing a little cash if people can do that, I think is a great way of supporting women in horror.
What is Alter you mentioned?
It's a YouTube channel, and I've seen a couple of films directed by women. They're short films. They were released there recently. So one of them that just came out was Maggie May, directed by Mia Kate Russell. And another one just came out a couple of days ago is Boo, directed by Rakefet Abergel. So those are two films that I know are directed by women and are featured there. Oh, and also Ashlyn Clark's short film Eye Exam is part of Halloween's Bite Size Horror, or Bite Size Halloween or something. So that's another short film to check out, just for people who have Hulu.
Awesome. That's cool that they're making they have women in horror film and horror like films on their website and YouTube channel. That's great. So what do you hope to see in the future of horror movies?
I just hope to see more experimentation, and I really love seeing how filmmakers, women and other filmmakers, are kind of changing what horror means. So we're not necessarily seeing the same subgenres over and over. We're seeing a lot of experimental horror and just horror hybrids and things like that, things that you wouldn't really think to put horror with. So I love seeing a lot of experimentation. I've seen a lot of really great horror comedy shorts. I've never been a big fan of horror comedy feature-length films, but I think the short form is a great place for horror and comedy to mingle. So I'd love to see more of that.
Do you think, we were just talking about this, my co-host and I, the other podcast, do you think that like slasher films kind of have disappeared, I would say? Or do you know of any like recent like slashers directed by women, or do you think it's kind of disappearing, that subgenre?
Well, there's Black Christmas that came out last year, the remake, directed by Sophia Takal. So there is some revisiting of the slasher subgenre. And I think a lot of women do love slashers, myself included, as you can see, my Camp Crystal Lake poster.
That's awesome.
Thanks. So yeah, I don't think it's going to disappear necessarily. There are some others that I've seen. Ruin Me a couple of years ago. It wasn't directed by a woman, but a lot of women worked on it. I think it was co-written by a woman. There were a couple of other slashers that I've seen recently that had women involved. So I do think it's gonna continue in some form or another.
So what are some horror movies directed by women you'd recommend watching tonight for Halloween?
I already mentioned it, but The Devil's Doorway is one of my top recommendations. It's really, really good. It's directed by Ashlyn Clark, a Northern Irish filmmaker, and it's set in a Magdalen laundry in the 1960s, and it was shot on 16 millimeter film. It's a found footage film about. It's a possession movie, basically. I don't want to say much more, but it's really good, really creepy. Another one is Office Killer, directed by Cindy Sherman. It came out in 1997, I think, or 8. And it's a horror comedy, and it's just this really weird, quirky, just grotesque comedy that hasn't been seen by that many people. I think it's been very underseen, and I would definitely recommend it. And a couple of other shorts that I haven't, one that I would really like to see but haven't had a chance to is called Suicide by Sunlight, and it's directed by Nikiatu Jusu. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but I've heard amazing things about this short. I just haven't been able to track it down. And a couple other shorts. I mentioned Maggie May, and another one called Creswick that I think is just available to watch online. So I don't remember exactly where, but it's directed by Natalie Erica James, who directed the recent film Relic, and it's amazing. So the short is called Creswick, and I saw it at a film festival a few years ago, and it's absolutely blown away. So definitely that one if you're interested in some like shorter horror. Oh, and Mariama Diallo's Hairwolf, sort of take on the werewolf movie. It's absolutely, definitely worth a watch. I think it was also streaming on Hulu, if I'm not wrong. So yeah, those are just some suggestions.
That sounds fun, like interesting, like a different werewolf movie.
Yeah.
I feel like that's not really like, I feel like monster movies need to come back. I don't know.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of werewolf movies recently, actually. There's one called Lone Wolf by January Jones. I don't think it's the same one as the actress, but different person. I'll actually be showing that next month. I've been organizing here in Pittsburgh a virtual Final Girls Berlin Film Festival short film block curated by the festival directors Eleanor Levy and Sarah Nydorf, and they're going to be special guests interviewing and talking about the films, and one of those films will be on there. So it'll be open, at least the conversation will be open to the public, so I'll send along information about that.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. What is the film festival called?
It's called Final Girls Berlin Film Festival, and it's in Berlin. I went a couple of years ago, and they used to do it twice a year. Now they do it once a year. I don't know what's going on with COVID exactly, but they've also done a lot of like Best of the Fest events in like Philly and Canada, Montreal, I think, and different places in Europe. So they're pretty active.
That's awesome. I'm working on a horror short. We're in post right now, so we're trying to plan our festival circuit, but right now it's kind of hard. But speaking about that, do you have any like suggestions for horror film festivals you've had experiences with, you think I should apply or filmmakers should apply to?
Yeah, I mean there are different. From what I understand of film festivals, there are different tiers. There's like the really ones that are really hard to get into, like the Sundance Midnights and things like that, and Toronto After Dark. And then there are some like more mid-level festivals that tend to be a lot more, I think, brave in terms of their programming. Like because they're able to show a lot of short films and things. So I'm trying to think of a few of those. Like one of them would be Nightmares Film Festival in Ohio. I don't know what they're doing in terms of COVID. Definitely lots of women in horror related film festivals like Axe Wound, Women in Horror Film Festival, Etheria Film Night, Final Girls Berlin, Bloody Mary Film Festival in Toronto, and Sick Chick Flicks in North Carolina. So those are a few like women in horror specific film festivals. But yeah, just like send it anywhere. Why not just like Fright Fest and all the big ones.
Cool. Thank you for the recommendations.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. What are your plans for Halloween?
Yeah, I don't really know yet because we're still not seeing too many people, obviously. I think we might just do a movie marathon at home.
That's fun though.
Yeah, I love just, watching Halloween on Halloween. I know it's kind of lame, but
No, that's a classic. I actually have a
Yeah.
poster over here.
oh, cool.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really fun.
Thank you.
Yep.